There's a moment when you realize the future we imagined decades ago might not have been so far off. Or maybe it got some things completely wrong. Today's episode dives into one of those visions, the bleak, overcrowded world of Soylent Green. I'm joined by film scholar Matthew Thompson, whose new book, On Life Support, explores how the eco-dystopian films of the 1970s captured the anxieties of the moment, and maybe even ours. We're talking environmental collapse, overpopulation, class divides, and why these films, from Soylent Green to Planet of the Apes, still hit a nerve today. And yeah, we'll get to that line. I'm Jason Herbert, and this is A Reckoning. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions, and this is A Reckoning. I'm sitting here wondering, actually, I don't think I recall when I was watching this film, green tea or hot tea was available during Soylent Green. I'm like, how do people calm down at that,
Right.
in this film and stuff? I see you got a mug there. What are you sipping on tonight? What do you got over there?
I'm drinking, do you know Holy Basil?
Mhm.
It's like, yeah, nice herbal tea, basically. Yeah, yeah. Holy Basil and ginger. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm drinking some sort of Bigelow, I don't know, some kind of green tea that I like to drink. I tell people now I'm slowly morphing into my great grandmother at this point in
Right.
time. Is the thing, dude? I am so excited to talk to you about this book that you did and these movies that are in this book. Matt, I've been running, I've been doing this watch party on historians of the movies for like 8 years now, and I grew up in the 80s. I think I know a lot about film, and then I open up your book and I am just floored at how much I don't know. And for me, I have to tell you, like the process of discovery in reading your book was so damn cool. Like these other films I had never really conceptualized or even known about beforehand. And I'm like constantly making up, like, go watch this thing. What is ARC? What is this about? And so forth. I'm having a blast with this. We have a lot to talk about because we're talking about one of these great. I mean, there's very few films with a line as famous as the line in this film, and I think everybody knows what we're talking about, and we'll get to that line in a little bit. But beforehand, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us what the heck you're doing here?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, Jason. My name is Matthew Thompson. I'm an assistant professor of film at the University of Regina. And my research generally looks at the ways that environmental politics find themselves expressed in science fiction, film, and literature a little bit as well. And I'm here to talk about On Life Support, my book that's coming out April 14th. And basically what it does, it looks at a period of films released in the 1970s that were decidedly sort of dystopian in tone. And what I argue is that those films took the environmental politics of the preceding decade, the 60s, when the modern environmental movement really got going with things like Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And I look at the ways that those politics found themselves expressed in these science fiction films. And I try to say that basically we can see some of the underlying assumptions that are actually kind of problematic more clearly in the films than we could in the politics themselves.
Yeah, in fact, this book in so many ways, Matt, really kind of, I've had this thought really since I started taking movies seriously about 8 years ago, and really started to say, like, look, the works that we do, the books that we write, and by all means, the book is fantastic. I loved it, and like, I'm so happy to have it. I'm not even kidding. Like, I find myself, I'm going to be flipping through it for a while, but I feel like so many people get their understandings of where we are in society and maybe even our past through film rather than books. It's maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit more approachable. Maybe it's easier. You don't have to spend hours and hours reading it. And, this book does this amazing job explaining what these movies are trying to tell us, the anxieties of the 70s and all of this. It's really quite brilliant, Matt. I loved it. And that really kind of leads me into maybe my first question here, Matt, which is, I'm going to give you two options here, which is that you can live in the world of Soylent Green, or you can arrive in Planet of the Apes 5 minutes too late. Like, what are your options here? Which way are you going? Which dystopia, my friend, are you going to choose to start?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, basically, probably based on my fear of flying a little bit, like I never want to get into a spaceship, basically, as much as I love science fiction. If I can stay off a spaceship, then I'll be much happier. So even though Soylent Green, the world, which is so overcrowded and dystopian and kind of unglamorous, unlike a lot of science fiction, I'd much rather be in that dystopian setting than, so far in the future that nobody that I ever knew or loved was alive, and I had to get into that spaceship, and maybe I had to spend time with Charlton Heston's character in that movie, who is very Taylor is his name, is very unpalatable character, and then otherwise a very few humans that you would have much connection with. So even though Soylent Green is dystopian in the sense of like feeling totally packed in, polluted, like the apocalypse is nigh sort of feeling, I'd still rather be with people, I think.
I was thinking about this earlier today, and I was like, which way would I go with this? And I feel like I'm going to go the opposite direction because, like, at this point in time, I'm like, you know what? Technology, I'm kind of done with at this point in time. There are beaches that I know that I can get to in Planet of the Apes. I'm assuming that they're livable since there are other livable species there, and there are some humans, and I could maybe create my own fiefdom at that point. It maybe serves my ego. I don't know. I like my chances there, but you're writing about this book in this long 1970s, and through the lens that you're writing about this feels like a really kind of like a dark period when we start to run through your head in some of the films that are made here, not only Soylent Green, and some of these Planet of the Apes, and we're talking about. So can we talk about maybe this kind of time period really it kind of runs between, say, the release of, say, 2001 A Space Odyssey, and really there's a shift, I guess really in 77 it's Star Wars, where these visions of the future are quite bleak. What are we talking about here with this long 70s period?
Yeah, so basically, you got it spot on. So there's this real sort of sea change in the science fiction landscape. There's a huge glut of science fiction films in the 1950s, and then that sort of wanes a little bit throughout the 60s, and then around 68, you have both 2001: A Space Odyssey and Planet of the Apes come out, and both of them are big budget, high concept, and thematically dark, right? And kind of ambiguous endings, you could say, and that they did well, and that proved, I think, basically that audiences had an appetite for this kind of film. And so then we saw films like Silent Running, Soylent Green, which we've already mentioned, Logan's Run, and a few other lesser well-known films that were released in this period that also aligned with the New Hollywood. So the New Hollywood was basically the studio system was falling apart. People weren't going to the movies anymore, in part because of TV. And the studios were trying to figure out how to make money. And then films like Bonnie and Clyde came out that were made by young, unknown directors, basically very low budget, and made huge amounts of money at the box office. And so the studios were just throwing money at anybody young, basically, who had a kind of counterculture aligned idea. And so, Silent Running is directed by Douglas Trumbull, who was the special effects guy on 2001. So he's young, he's kind of like at least adjacent to the counterculture, and he's very good with effects. So he makes Silent Running, which is this film, which is an answer to, in his words, 2001. It's a warmer, more kind of, kind of politically charged film that is still, it's dystopian in the sense that there's no greenery left on Earth, but actually the human side of things appears to be doing well in that film. Basically, humans are living on synthetic food. Everybody has a job. The economy is doing great. It's just that the whole Earth is a static 75 degrees Fahrenheit, basically, in that film. And so it seemed as though people were interested in this kind of cynical dystopian outlook, and they were going to those movies. And I think it lined up with the 70s kind of culture writ large, as things like, Watergate, the Vietnam War, the OPEC oil crisis, all of these sort of cataclysms were happening that were kind of, signaling this moment where the flower power generation was kind of coming of age and getting jobs, and things were looking a lot less bright than they were in the 60s.
We were trying to figure out which film to kind of center this conversation around early on, and there were a bunch of films that you talk about in the book, and we'll talk about a lot of these today. I think we're kind of centering maybe this, using Soylent Green as as an example. But I really want to get into a lot of these other things as well, and really kind of flash forward to today, because it feels, Matt, like we've got a bit of a renaissance of some of these eco-dystopian films. A little bit. Whenever I just got back from watching Project Hail Mary. Interstellar is one of my favorite. There's so much stuff we can talk about here, but I wonder, when we were trying to figure out in your mind's eye, like, why write about and why talk about Soylent Green? Why is this particular film so important amongst all the other ones?
Yeah, so Soylent Green, it's set in actually the year 2022. So we've already sort of passed the date that it's set in, and it's set in New York City. And basically, it's this very overcrowded New York City where the food resources are really sparse, and everyone's surviving on these wafers. They're called Soylent wafers. They have different colors. Actually, on Tuesday, Soylent Green comes out, and so that's actually where Green Day got their name, I think, is Soylent Green. Tuesday is Soylent Green Day. In any event, so in this world, it's overpacked, it's polluted. There's a smog that diffuses everywhere. People are sleeping in the stairwells of every building. And there's one police detective played by Charlton Heston, who's named Thorne, and he's tasked with solving this murder that happens in a high rise in a sort of swanky apartment building. And it's a corporate executive of the corporation Soylent has been murdered. And he's trying to figure out, basically, why was this guy killed? Was it just a botched burglary, or was there something more nefarious going on? And that research basically leads him down this path of discovery as to what actually is going into the Soylent wafers. And the reason I think that this film is kind of emblematic of the films of that period is, on the surface, it seems to be sort of communicating an important ecological message that, like, too many people on the planet is bad for the environment. It's bad for people. We use up all the resources. There's not enough, jobs. The economy can't support that many people. It's stressing the carrying capacity, which was a popular term in the 1970s. But when you sort of peer under the hood in this film, you start to see that it actually is full of kind of fears and desires that drive ecological rhetoric that come from problematic sources. So, the book itself is heavily inspired by Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, which was a bestseller in the late 60s. And it argued basically that if we didn't do something drastic, the population would continue to grow to the point at which many, many people would die. And Paul Ehrlich was basically, picking up on the Malthusian rhetoric from the previous century that had trickled down and was heavily inspired by eugenics and the sort of idea that there's a kind of social responsibility for certain genetic people to breed and others to not, basically. Mm-hmm. And it's really dark stuff when you start looking at, where are these ideas coming from? And it's presented in a more palatable manner in things like Soylent Green. It's not like maybe on the surface, but when you start looking at it more carefully, you can see that there. And there's also sort of spoiler alert, but most people know, right? By the end of the film, you learn Soylent Green is made out of people. So there's cannibalism baked in there. And I think that the cannibalism is also really interesting.
Quite literally baked in there. But I'm thinking here about so much that's going on in the 1970s, because so much pop culture is a reflection of the time if it is, right? I always tell us, like, no matter when the film is focused, it's telling you more about today than, at the time this being made. Dare we introduce the concept of a different book, Matt? Can we talk about Silent Spring and really its importance really to this era and its influence on the making of this film?
Yeah, absolutely. So Silent Spring is Rachel Carson's probably most important book. It comes out as a series of New Yorker articles that are then turned into a book in 1962. And in it, Carson, who was a science journalist and also worked for U.S. fisheries, oceans and fisheries, I think. And she was collecting all these scientific reports of pesticide use throughout America into this very compelling narrative. It'll be very familiar to you and many of your listeners, I'm sure. And it had a tremendous impact. It's one of these things you can point to in, environmental studies where you could say, like, this book led to this and this and this thing. And it's sort of like a lot easier to say this had this effect because it was so impactful. So many people read it. And a lot of I go back through and read the book quite carefully for the rhetoric and the generic tendencies that Carson is drawing on. She's a beautiful writer, and I noticed that she uses science fiction. Actually, the first chapter is called "A Fable for Tomorrow," and she creates this fictional town, basically, where she collects a whole bunch of different incidents that have happened in real life across the country and collects them into one town. Just says, what if there were no pollinators and children were dying and people were getting cancer and there were no bald eagles and, all of these sorts of things in one place, and then says, wouldn't that be terrible? And basically what I argue in the book is that we can really see this cross-pollination of influence between science fiction and environmentalism going on in the 60s. And then also Carson is really good at using rhetorical figuration to get her point across. So she uses a trope called metonymy, where it's basically like a part for the whole, or synecdoche is another way that people refer to it. And Carson basically says, like, the same thing that's happening out there, DDT, this pesticide is killing the salmon in the streams, and it's killing the earthworms in the soil, and it's killing the eagles because it's making their eggshells too thin. And those things, the streams are like your blood vessels, the soil is like your organs, and the eagles in the air are like in your lungs. Basically, like the planet's a body, and we are ourselves bodies, and therefore what's happening to the planet is happening to us. And that really affected people. Basically, they were already freaked out by radiation from the 1950s, this invisible toxic substance that you couldn't see or detect, really.
Mm-hmm.
And so that applied really easily all of a sudden to things like DDT, and people were justifiably freaked out.
Matt, we're kind of talking maybe about American audiences when we talk about the reactions here in the film, but also, obviously Canada's right there. Are Canadians responding in the same way? Are Canadians going through the same thing in the 1970s that Americans are, so having these same kinds of concerns about the environment, these anxieties, these fears? Like, how are Canadians responding? Is it similar, different?
Well, that's a great question. I think in some ways, Canadians respond in similar ways to issues that Americans do, but there's always a slight difference. And, in the chapter where I talk about Carson in the book, I compare her work to a Canadian filmmaker named David Cronenberg. Again, many people will be familiar with his body horror, and he's sort of like a quintessentially Canadian filmmaker, despite Canadians, you could say, almost, like, because there's almost nothing Canadian about him. And, he's so grotesque and gruesome that many Canadians were pretty shocked when his first films came out. But he's a brilliant filmmaker, and we're very proud to have him, obviously. And he was a biology student at the University of Toronto in the 60s. Really hard to imagine you wouldn't read Soylent Spring in that period if you're studying biology. And then he switched into English, and he started making films pretty shortly thereafter. But his films have this persistent ecological theme, I find. And so his first major feature was called Shivers, or They Came From Within. And it was about these parasites, basically, that were invented by a kind of mad Frankenstein-like scientist. And he introduces those parasites into a young woman, and they become basically sex zombies. Like, they turn people into these sex zombies, so they have sex and sexually transmit the parasite, and eventually the parasites grow, and then they start burrowing out of people's bodies in these horrible ways. Yeah.
Wow, your research sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I've been thinking for long periods of time about parasites and what they do to the body. And what I argue is that Carson and Cronenberg were doing something similar. They were saying there's no boundary between the inside of the human body and the outside. The sort of idea that we're these bounded entities is a fiction, and that fiction allows us to do things like pollute the environment willy-nilly without any consequences, because we think that it's not going to affect us. But Cronenberg, throughout his filmmaking career, has been sort of rendering these porous bodies really viscerally on screen. And so I also talk about The Fly, which many people may have seen from the 80s, where Jeff Goldblum's character, Seth Brundle, teleports himself with the fly and then becomes fused with that fly genetically and slowly turns into that fly. And I make the argument that, when we're poisoning insects, we're also poisoning ourselves. And Cronenberg helps us to see that because he makes the insect and the human one and the same, basically, as Carson was doing as well.
So funny, because I woke up probably 2 weeks ago thinking about The Fly, and I have no idea why. I was thinking it was before I started reading the book, and I was like, I was thinking about Cronenberg, and I was thinking about it's such an amazing film, and I haven't had time to digest it or think about it like this, and now I feel like this is going to have to be a thing we're going to have to address on the pod at a later date, because it's too damn good. of a film. Um, you know, I'm kind of wondering. You talk about these anxieties that are being replicated and shown on screen, demonstrated, and things like that, as far as overpopulation, pollution, stuff like that. Can we talk for a sec? I always like to joke that I moved out to Colorado and turned into Karl Marx because of the class dynamics out here. Can we talk about the ways in which we're seeing class play, and maybe our American audience is really thinking about class in this post-civil rights era? Like, what's going on screen where we see this in Soylent Green, and then how is that kind of talking about what Americans are maybe going through?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that there's this kind of mixture. Obviously, the Vietnam War and the Cold War is this context of like extreme anti-communism,
Mm-hmm.
anti-socialism, and so anything that sort of smells like that at all, obviously, is attacked. And there's maybe a difference between Canada and the U.S. Like in Canada, it's much easier to call oneself a socialist, to kind of adopt socialist policies and things like that. I wish it was even easier than it was, but and then in Soylent Green, there is this class. There's very much a class dynamic going on because you can see the difference between a police detective who at least gets his own apartment with a roommate and the people who have to sleep in the stairwells and on the streets and are rioting for food. There's also these iconic bulldozers that pick people up called the scoops, and they just scoop people into the back. You realize probably to be taken to the Soylent factory and turned into wafers. And then there's this CEO of Soylent who lives in this luxurious apartment, which also comes with a live-in sex worker, basically. And that's a part of the film that I think actually comes across as very problematic. You could say in some ways it's a dystopia, so it's meant to be scary and not nice. But the way that Charlton Heston's police detective treats these women when we're identified with him is very disturbing, I would say. So there's class politics, but they're like 70s liberal white class politics in the sense
Mm-hmm.
that it's like there's certain people who deserve more rights than others, that's there's a lot of kind of environmental nostalgia in the film as well, wishing for a time in the past when the environment was healthier, but it's also a time that has all of these problematic elements associated with it, like less rights for marginalized people.
How how does Soylent Green kind of compare to say some of these other films of the era? Because there's enough of them to write an entire book about, Matt. Like can we talk a little bit about some of these other movies that are kind of the contemporaries to Soylent Green, kind of running up to? And it's funny. I was trying to decide what we are going to watch on the watch party that we do on Sunday nights. I saw Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the remake, right? What 78 is that the one with Sutherland?
Mm-hmm.
And that one's really supposed to be the highlight of the series. I'm like, well, maybe that might be one to talk about. But I hadn't even thought about it in context with these books, with these other films, but they're right here in your book.
Yeah, I mean, I love that version. It's also got an early Jeff Goldblum. Leonard Nimoy is in it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's an incredible cast. Yeah, it's such a great film. And basically, I was writing this plant chapter. The fourth chapter is all about, because in the 70s there was this house plant craze, and there was like plant music being written, and everybody was trying to talk to plants telepathically. Um, and I thought, while I was writing the book, I was like, I'm going to write a chapter on Invasion of the Body Snatchers. But sometimes you set out to write a chapter on something and you end up writing about something else. So Invasion of the Body Snatchers is in there, but only in
Mm-hmm.
a small bit. But what I really like about that film is, it takes the original, which is like also such a great film from the 50s, and really updates it and makes it so much more vegetal. Like the pods are really, really planty, and it also kind of does this nice thing with conspiracy theories. I don't know if you've seen Begonia,
No.
the new Yorgos Lanthimos film, but it's sort of an
Tell me.
interesting kind of like trip down conspiracy theory rabbit hole, basically. And it kind of toys with your idea of like maybe some of the conspiracies are real, maybe they're not. And I think that 70s version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, it's got this, it heavily cites this book Worlds in Collision, which was basically this idea that I think like that planets have come past Earth before very recently, and upended things and ended civilizations. And it was this total pseudoscientific book that was popular at the time. And it's, there was also this pseudoscientific book called The Secret Life of Plants, which I do talk a lot about. And I think both of those are influencing Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
You mentioned planets flying by one another, and what immediately popped in my head was the opening credits to this cartoon show in the early 1980s, late 70s, Thundar the Barbarian. Do you know the show?
I don't know it actually.
It is a direct like ripoff of like Conan and Star Wars, set in a post-apocalyptic future in which a planet like comes too close and disrupts our orbit. There's a Chewbacca like character named Ukla, and
Wow.
Thundar, our hero, has a electric sword, and which he goes around fighting bad guys and righting wrongs, and with the help of his with his Ukla friend. You've got to check this out.
Wow.
It's
Wow.
that's the
That sounds
first thing I'm
perfect.
thinking of, and that
Yeah.
was my childhood, Matt. I'm
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
oh, this is how I'm supposed to see the world, and that might explain the tail end of Gen X. I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
What about some of these other films that are happening? At this time, we talked about Planet of the Apes. I mean, I feel like Omega Man's a thing that we've got to
Hmm.
talk about as well. Some
Hmm.
of these other they're taking these other stories here. What are these other eco-dystopian films? You taught me a lot of words in this book, my
Right.
friend.
Yeah.
What are these other films that you like in this era as well that are sending similar messages?
Another film that I talk a lot about in the book, and is really the film that kind of like structures, I would say, the sort of method of the book, is called Silent Running. And
Mm-hmm.
that's this film I mentioned a little bit. There's this future where all non-human nature on Earth is dead, and the only surviving ecosystems are preserved on these geodesic domes on a spaceship in space, basically. And so last non-human nature is preserved on these domes in space. But a funding cut is announced, and they need to get jettisoned, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a 4-person crew on this spaceship, and there's one ecologist played by Bruce Dern, and he basically mutinies. He refuses to kill the last non-human nature, and so he kills the 3 members of the crew, and he hijacks the spaceship and starts piloting into deep space. And at the time, in the 60s, in particular, Buckminster Fuller was this sort of famous kooky thinker and engineer. He created domes like the ones on
Mm-hmm.
the ship in Silent Running. And he also popularized this metaphor of spaceship Earth. Basically, at the time, right now the Artemis mission is coming back to Earth, and the Apollo missions at the time were giving us the first images of the Earth from space. Everyone was thinking about spaceships in the 60s, and then Buckminster Fuller helped us to realize actually the Earth itself is like a spaceship. It's basically a life support system that travels through space and keeps us all alive. It gives us oxygen to breathe, food and water to eat and drink. It takes care of our waste. It's this incredible machine, basically, like one that we're trying to design to go to the moon. And while at first that kind of encourages you to try to protect it, it's like the way that we're acting on board Spaceship Earth. If we were astronauts, it would seem insane the way that we're just using the resources and not thinking about the future at all. Like we're acting here in ways that would be considered insane if we were astronauts. So it seems like an effective sort of metaphor, basically, for how we should live on Earth. But when you look at it visualized in the ship in Silent Running, you start to see that basically it has this fantasy of control, containment and control in it. And one of the things I argue is that environmentalists are obsessed with containing and controlling non-human nature in order to try and preserve it. And so the ship in Silent Running is basically the apotheosis of that. It's like you get to finally completely contain non-human nature, completely control it, and live out this fantasy that we know how to do that. But in fact, we don't, right? Every time that we try to contain and control non-human nature, it goes badly one way or another. And so what I argue is that we need to adopt environmental rhetoric that acknowledges that everything is interconnected, everything is contaminated even, and get rid of sort of ways of thinking about the environment that says like a national park is going to protect environment. That's all we need is these like postage stamps of environment, and that's going to do the trick. The environment in the cities, we don't need to worry about that. The environment in the global south, we don't need to worry about that. And so basically that's Silent Running does that. It's an incredible movie, and I love it, obviously, and I love the metaphor of Spaceship Earth. But I also think that it contains within it these problematic assumptions that have caused many of the failures of environmentalism today.
You say Spaceship Earth. When I was a young guy, many pounds ago, I worked at Walt Disney World. I worked at Epcot in the college program, and now I'm immediately thinking about Epcot and how this was. Epcot's formulation was what was Walt Disney's dream. That was his real thing, and of course, Spaceship Earth being the big piece of that. And I'm wondering if he's being influenced by all of this as well. And I had never even thought about maybe the negative connotations that go with Epcot, because it was really his big thing. It's planning this experimental prototype community of tomorrow. Um, I'm wondering though, we see in the 1970s, Matt, and I don't know if this happens in Canada as well, so please forgive me. But I'm wondering, we see a ton of environmental legislation ripping through, beginning really with Nixon. He's actually trying to appeal to, he's doing his best to appeal to liberal voters, thinking that's going to get him over the hump in re-election. It doesn't. So he quickly abandons that. But we see that through Nixon, and then especially through Carter's administration. Do you see an influence of these films on, to say, American policy making in the 70s as well?
I think it's often difficult to sort of pinpoint where influence kind of comes and goes. And it's easier to sort of, talk in broader strokes of like, this was part of a cultural moment that certainly was influencing politics, and I do find it fascinating that Nixon created the EPA, for example. Nixon, I'm pretty sure, banned DDT, if I'm remembering correctly. Like, Nixon did do these kind of, and in the environmental politics of that time were way less polarized. It hadn't turned into this left versus right dialogue. I think it was still more progressives were on board with ecological issues, but it wasn't as polarized as it is today. But what I think is really fascinating is my understanding is that Carter, dealt with two basically oil crises, and in 1979 was dealing with the second one with the Iranian Revolution, and was really interested in energy sovereignty. And so Carter was like piling effort into making the United States sovereign in terms of their energy needs, and was really investing in renewables. And he actually put solar panels on the roof of the White House in 1979. And then Reagan was elected, tore those down. He couldn't even just leave them up there, right? And the entire rhetoric around energy and the environment changed in the 80s. And you can see that in the films. Like, David Lynch's Dune came out in the early 80s. Dune is a very ecological book. Frank Herbert himself was stationed at a dune ecology station, and a lot of his inspiration for that book came from desert ecology. There's an ecologist in the book that features prominently, and that has come back in the Villeneuve adaptations. But that ecological message is absent from the early 80s version of Dune. And Blade Runner 2 is 1982. Comes from Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, a super ecological novel where all the animals are extinct and there's only these, replicant animals. And in the film, if you know the book, you can see that happening, but it's not a major theme, as great as that film is. And so you can really see how this ecological moment and the science fiction that was kind of channeling it really ended in the 80s. And it's deeply sad to think about how different our current moment could be if the solar panels had stayed on the White House, basically.
Yeah, there's a fun thing as an American historian going that you can trace everything bad in the United States now to Reagan. So that's fun. And maybe Matt, maybe that's the great dystopia of them all, was called the 80s. We got some music out of it, I guess, but like everything else, like we're still dealing. I do genuinely think that we are still dealing with the fallout from that administration. I think it was so catastrophically bad, and I think that Reagan got by on a lot of charisma in the 80s, and a different different relationship to media, where he could get by with a lot more stuff. I guess the amazing thing about Reagan was that he was such a great politician to be such a bad president, especially when we talk about, say, environmental matters and things like that. Because you're absolutely right. Like, Carter seems ahead of his time, and I feel like sometimes I'm almost like on this mission to rehabilitate Carter's image, because I actually think Carter's a really good president in a lot of different. He's not perfect, but I think he's really ahead of the game in a lot of different ways. And I think you're right. If we could only imagine like 4 more years of Carter, what happens?
Yeah.
All right, I want to move forward a little bit, Matt, and talk. We talk about this long 70s, this dark period. And of course, Reagan's coming in and he's really speaking. Carter's like, look, we're in a malaise. This is what's going on. And people are kind of down in the 70s. And it's reflected in these films, right? And in a lot of other stuff like Assault on Precinct 13. You watch a lot of films in the 70s. They are kind of dark and bleak and not a lot of fun to watch in a lot of different ways. And Reagan comes in and sells this idea of this hip, happy world. And I think you're talking about, like, really, it's interesting because I think when we talk about science fiction of the 50s and 60s, we're interested in extraterrestrials or other things coming in. The 80s presents us different version. We get Star Wars and we get E.T. and we get these other things. But then there's a tonal shift. And I'm kind of wondering, when do we start to see this version of eco-dystopia again? And what do you think is the cause for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, you can always find examples here and there outside of the norm, but I would say basically in the early aughts, 2010s, we're starting to see much more ecological science fiction come out. We have the kind of classic, like The Day After Tomorrow style film,
Sure.
which comes out, if I'm not mistaken, pretty shortly after Inconvenient Truth, the Al Gore documentary, which really kind of kickstarted the climate change conversation again. We've known about climate change since about 1896, but this conversation keeps coming back up again and feels new each time. So we get The Day After Tomorrow. And then, there's a bunch of examples, but one of the ones that I think really stands out to me is Snowpiercer. Snowpiercer, I think it's 2013.
Amazing
Such a great film. And, it's this future where, one of the kind of climate mitigation strategies is to shoot reflective particulate into the atmosphere to basically bounce the sun rays back out. And it imagines a future where they put too much out there and it created like a global ice age. And everybody who's left on Earth is living on this train. Mm-hmm. And like Soylent Green, it's all about the class kind of distinctions and the food that people are eating. And it is often a film about food, right? And you'll remember, instead of wafers made out of humans, in Snowpiercer, they're eating bugs that are turned into basically Jello. But at the front of the train, in the higher class cars, they're eating sushi. And there's this whole moment where Tilda Swinton's character, who's held hostage, is explaining to them the sushi process. They sit down at a sushi bar, these people from the back of the train who've only ever eaten bug goop, basically. And she says, well, it's a very tightly controlled ecological balance here. Once a year, we get to have sushi because there's only that much fish on the train, and we carefully control the ins and outs, and it's this, like, you realize this eco-fascist basically narrative of containment and control that you can see in films like Silent Running and Soylent Green, and these films that are just saying, like, what we need is more control of the environment. But in Snowpiercer, you can see that it was environmental control that caused the apocalypse, and that's feeding a few people very well, while the rest are starving and suffering in the back of the train.
Yeah, the class distinctions are always like right there, and I'm thinking about when we see I forget the concubine, and she's looking for that steak in Soylent Green. Like, here's a real steak. Yeah, it's on a hanger. It's ready, right? And Charlton Heston, he's going to that scene where he goes to the bathroom and there's running water, Matt. And he's just washing his hand. I'm like, oh my gosh, this man has been dirty for the longest time, and just the ability for him to drink out of the faucet is this huge thing that, like, the lower classes simply don't get to do. And then I start to think about other films, like, I kind of wonder if you consider these apocalypse films. There was Armageddon, and then Deep Impact that kind of hit, I think, 98, 99-ish is that when they come in?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and really, even Deep Impact was even more so about this, about, like, who do we save? Who do we put on these? Who do we put, like, was it 2012 does the same thing, where they're quite literally creating these arcs and stuff. So they use these things to talk about class. And it's, to me, did you see Greenland at all? Have you seen that yet?
Yes, I actually love that movie.
I really liked it too. Like, I thought it was really, really good. And I'm kind of wondering how they're going to do the sequel.
Yeah, I guess they'll be underground in Greenland, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, from the trailer that I've seen, it's like, okay, they're underground, but that can't hold them for much longer, because now because humans aren't supposed to be underground. They're developing these respiratory viruses and blah blah blah, and they break out, and now they have to go to France, which is where there's but there's people who have survived, and so now you get to tell these other stories. These eco-dystopian stories become like ways to talk about class struggle and relationships. And I don't know, zombie films, The Last of Us comes to my mind for some reason as well. Did you watch that on the series?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah.
I'm thinking the most terrifying scene of that is the very beginning, where he's like, this is what could happen, with these mushrooms and fungi.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I was going to say, just talking about Greenland and talking about a lot of these ecological dystopian films, is they often involve things like fallout shelters, things like submarines, things like spaceships, greenhouses. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that we can think of all these things as life support. That's why the book's called On Life Support, is there little encapsulations of the planetary whole. And it's another one of these part for the whole metonymies, right? Where we're trying to recreate the biosphere in miniature on a spaceship, let's say, or also underground in fallout shelter. And like in Greenland, a lot of the time our imaginations are like, these are going to fail. Like, we can't do this. And there was this famous experiment in the 90s called Biosphere 2, where they locked people into a completely contained environment for a year, and it didn't work. They had to pipe oxygen in, get them some food. We're not there yet where we can recreate the biosphere. And I argue that's because it's too complicated. We have this myth that we can do, that we have the technology and the know-how to do this sort of stuff. But I think that myth is harming us, because we always are trying to fix each ecological problem with like more control, instead of just saying, let's let the environment do its own thing for a bit in this way or that way, like rewilding or allowing forest fires to burn, or, there's all these examples of letting things kind of be a bit chaotic works out better than these attempts at controlling it.
Yeah, and thank you for that, because now I'm afraid we're going to have to do biosphere on this podcast at some point. Like, now we've tried to avoid Polyshore for 3 years,
right?
On this pod. I want to ask you. I typically try to prep people on this pod for stuff that for questions I want to ask. I've got a few other questions I did not prep you for, Matt, and I kind of want to rip them at you and see what you think. If you're ready, are you ready for this?
Yeah, sounds great.
All right. First eco-dystopian film that comes to mind. What pops in your head and why?
Okay, I'll talk about Frogs, basically, which is this revenge of nature film that it's a B movie, low budget, not very well regarded, let's say, but I love it, and in part because instead of using often with like revenge of nature films, they'll use puppets and blown up versions of things. They make them bigger and scarier, and often as a result less photogenic. And in Frogs, they just shot these they're actually cane toads, these cane toads up close really beautifully on 70s 35 millimeter film, and they're really like sort of ominous and creepy but beautiful too. And so the whole film, there's all these different reptiles, amphibians, and insects that are killing this really nasty family of kind of white corporate polluters. It's very satisfying to watch everyone get killed by these very real insects and frogs and things like that. And I like that film because it is just one of those pure revenge of nature films where you're cheering for the monsters the whole time against these really nasty people.
We were just talking about the 80s, and I did not bring up Mad Max, and I feel like people were just probably screaming at us as they were listening. What are you talking about? There's Mel Gibson, and then of course the new Mad Max films, which brings me up to our next question. Scarier future: the overpopulation of Soylent Green, or the desertification, and that's a real word apparently, in Mad Max?
I guess, I'm picturing the new Mad Max in particular, and I think that future to me seems like weirdly a little more promising for some reason. There's sort of like room for ingenuity, let's say, or something like that, and room to breathe, even if it's very dry air, let's say. So the Mad Max future appeals to me. I just rewatched Waterworld recently.
Do tell.
Which is a blast, and it's sort of like Mad Max, but the whole world is underwater because of glacial melt, and some kind of kooky performances where various people are chewing the scenery pretty hard. But
Dennis Hopper, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. But there's some things about that apocalyptic future that are appealing as well.
More haunting: the ending of Planet of the Apes, or the ending of Omega Man?
I think I'd have to say Planet of the Apes. I really love that when he finds the Statue of Liberty and falls to his knees. It's that's one of my favorite films. So yeah.
It's maybe we talk about these films, right? That I think that film, probably the ending of that's maybe even more famous than Soylent Green. When we talk about like the end, it's like What do we do?
And Charlton Heston is in all three, which is sort of interesting,
Right.
and he sort of, I always think that you can see the beginnings of his NRA era in Planet of the Apes. The way he's clutching that gun at the end of the film.
I wonder if these films of him as like this lone crusader against this one guy who knows the truth,
Yeah,
is positioning him later on subliminally as like this leader of the NRA.
yeah.
He's this man's man. We talk about things that made you uncomfortable. I was doing the math when I was watching Soylent Green because he's like 20 something years older than
Mm-hmm.
the woman that
Yeah,
he's with. And I think he's like my age. I'm 48. And I think he's like
yeah,
46, 47
yeah,
in this film. And she's like 26. And I was like,
yeah.
it's nothing,
Yeah,
Eh,
yeah, it's not seen as strange at all in that era, and yeah, and I think like he was, relatively progressive then, and but you
mhm.
can kind of see again how like these sort of like the overpopulation discourse. He was actually one of the people who pressed. I'm pretty sure it was MGM to make a film out of Make Room, because he was really worried about overpopulation. He wanted to make a message film, basically. And, as I argue in the book, like overpopulation on the surface sounds like an ecological issue that we can all get behind. But when you dig deeper in, it does have these racist undertones where it's more like, well, I want certain people to reproduce and others not, basically.
Yeah, I really like your ideas about this eugenics argument. And I'm thinking about there was a film a few years ago with Ewan McGregor and Scarlett Johansson, a very young, The Colony, which feels in
Oh
a
yeah.
lot of ways very similar, obviously borrowing a lot from this film, right? Um, and I hadn't thought about this, but like there's definitely that idea. Like as I understand it, the cannibalism is not in the source material, correct? Like that's a thing that gets added on in the film, right?
It is, yeah, and Harry Harrison, the author of Make Room, the source novel, was upset about this. He writes about it at length in a later piece. He thought it was a totally unnecessary addition. But I think both it makes the film better because it
Scarier,
gives us this
yeah.
really interesting element. But I also argue in the book that the film, even though it seems like the film is presenting this cannibalism as a terrible thing, I argue that a lot of the people in the film realize that this cannibalism is necessary, basically, because the population is so it has exploded so much that it's like untenable. And when you cannibalize people voluntarily, people are going to get euthanized. That's like part of the plot of the
Hmm.
film. So people are volunteering to be killed, and then you reduce the population and you increase the food supply. And so obviously it's violating this enduring taboo. But I make the argument in the book that in these extreme conditions, basically you could say that this is an intelligent solution. And Saul, who's played by Edward G. Robinson, it's his last film.
Great. He's so good in this.
He's really good, yeah. And he's Thorne's basically research assistant, and he's trying to track down, why was this, executive of Soylent murdered? It's because he was about to leak the truth that Soylent Green was made out of people. But so he knows that he confesses to a priest. Saul, Edward G. Robinson's character, learns about it. Nobody says anything through the whole film. And obviously it's a plot twist, and the film is structured
Mm.
to not let us know. But I also argue that you can kind of read it against the grain, as they all realize that basically, okay, this is horrible, but if we let everyone know about this, then they're all going to starve to death. And so Saul, as soon as he learns that Soylent Green is made out of people, he goes straight to the euthanasia center and submits himself to be eaten. And I think in this film, like, that's a very strange thing to do, unless you basically believed that that was the right thing to do. Why wouldn't you just keep living? Or why would you be like, oh my god, everyone's cannibals, okay, well, eat me,
Right.
unless you basically believe that that was the right thing to do. And so I sort of end up trying to read the film as this, radical ecological proposition that cannibalism actually, if the people voluntarily submit themselves to be eaten, might be an excellent solution to overpopulation and food shortage.
Well, you look at it, and even Heston's character, when he makes this big proclamation, people are like, "Okay,
Yeah,
it,
yeah,
great, terrific. That's good to
yeah,
know." You know,
yeah, yeah.
so I
Yeah,
mean,
it's
I
true. It does sort of fall on deaf ears, and one thing is like, oh, he finally figured it out. We all knew that for a long time.
yeah, it's like, shut up, dude. It's Thursday. I got 4 more days
Yeah,
until I get some more wafers.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
can I ask you? You watch an inordinate amount of film, which I'm kind of jealous about. and I'm kind of wondering. I'm going to give you a few films, and I'm going to ask you which might be the most believable dystopia.
Okay. All right.
Children of Men, Soylent Green,
Mm-hmm.
Wall-E. What do you got?
Well, I'll say I think in terms of most believable, I feel like Children of Men makes a lot of sense. Like I
That
can
opening
really
scene.
picture a situation where some kind of, we're all saturated with chemicals
Oh, sure.
that we don't know the effects. And, it's not hard for me to imagine that in 20, 30, 40 years, that it's obviously a stretch, but you can sort of picture that happening. But I think, I'm actually writing a piece right now about Wall-E and this new film, The Wild Robot. So I've been thinking about Wall-E a lot lately. And basically, I'm looking at these imaginations of future AIs that take care of the environment for us. And I'm trying to explore, why do we keep imagining in children's film in particular, these robots that are going to take care of the environment for us? And I'm saying it's a fantasy, basically, that we know as humans that we're not good at taking care of the environment. We are having a really hard time doing it. And we really want AI in particular to take care of it for us. That's what the tech billionaires are selling us on AI about, is this idea that it's going to solve climate change along with a host of other problems. And I think these films are doing a lot of ideological work, basically saying leave it up to the robots. They'll sort it out. It allows us to basically kick the can down the road and kind of hope that the robots are going to do it for us. And so I've been thinking about that a lot. And, Wall-E, obviously, it's such a great film. And The Wild Robot is also a really good watch if you haven't seen it.
I haven't, and it's the thing that I've been circling. And I'm, you bring up the idea of AI, and I'm kind of wondering. Obviously, we talk about anxieties of AI. The first thing that people pop in there is Terminator, right? Very first thing. But now that AI is very much here, Matt, I just saw a thing the other day that there are these talks about putting an AI data center in Colorado Springs. And there's all these fears now about I look on the internet and I see on Instagram, the water supply needed for these things. And I'm kind of wondering, are you starting to see concerns about AI in this new fashion? Not as machines rising up against us, but in these other fashions. Are you seeing this flipped around in pop media?
Well, what I think, I'm finding, at least in the children's media, is that it's not there's often sort of two sides to it. And this is consistent with also the 70s dystopian films. Usually, and 50s science fiction as well, usually the issue comes because of technology and it's solved by technology, right? And so in Wall-E, Wall-E is cleaning things up, finds a plant, it triggers this whole kind of bringing the human Ark ship back to Earth. But the AI captain on that ship is fighting Wall-E the whole time, Wall-E and Eve, right? And so you can see it's two AIs facing off against each other, which I think is really interesting. And then in The Wild Robot, a similar thing happens. The Wild Robot is this stranded robot by herself on this island. She becomes a mother to a little duckling and tries to help it to learn how to migrate. But her robot, the company that basically runs her sort of series of robots comes and tries to find her, basically to research her brain and what happened to her when she machine learned on this island for so many years. And I think we can really see there these two competing ideas of AI, but both of them are sort of AI is incredible and competent, and it's sort of which version are we going to do? But I think a lot of the reason that we have so much faith in what's being called AI these days is because science fiction is feeding us all of these versions. Skynet is a great example of this hyper competent AI, right? What we're seeing, the actual output from AI, is often, in my experience at least, both using it and talking to people who do, it's not actually doing things that well. It's making a lot of mistakes, but we're so impressed by it because obviously it's an incredible innovation. But we have this rhetoric and this kind of structure of thinking from science fiction that's this is artificially intelligent. And even though we know it's just basically reproducing words on a page, you get these sort of inklings that there's some kind of consciousness back there. It's really hard to suppress. When we're thinking about a movie like Her, which I think, really does a great job of imagining, a much more realistic AI scenario, let's say, where it doesn't really matter. I mean, obviously the AI in Her is conscious, but you can imagine that movie could work if it wasn't conscious. It just appeared to be conscious.
I've been asking you which dystopia you'd prefer to live in. You watch all these films. Which would you least prefer to live? What is your worst nightmare?
Well, I'll say I think probably Interstellar. I
Good
find
call.
films where they're abandoning Earth completely in order to
Mm.
try and get to some other planet. I just find that so dark and sad. Basically, I think that the same way that we're turning all this effort to making AI data centers or trying to get to Mars, let's say, it's like let's turn all that money and effort into preserving this place. It is already this incredible place to live. It's still got so much potential. It's thriving in a lot of ways despite what we're doing to it. And so any film that's like, the planet's dead, we're going to go and find a new planet, and Interstellar obviously kind of comes around to this idea that isn't exactly that, but I found that the giving up on planet Earth is the worst dystopia for me, basically.
Is there a best dystopian film that you like the most?
Maybe the Blade Runner world. I think I would really like living in the Blade Runner world. Yeah.
Can you give me your hot take on 2049? What are your thoughts?
So the first time I watched it, I was like, Blade Runner was one of the first science fiction films I probably ever saw. My mom showed it to me, on VHS when I was growing up, and so I was very precious about it. But I also try to be open minded, and I loved Arrival.
Oh yeah, sure, yeah.
So I was going in with this complicated set of emotions, and the first time I was like, it was good, but it's nothing like the original. And then as I rewatched it, I just thought, wow, it's so interesting, the idea of pregnancy and the replicants. It's really turning the screw on, like, trying to detect who's replicant, who's not. And I think that the way that it sort of like didn't just take the movie's ideas and stick with them, but it actually tried to like move it further forward and enter new ethical ideas into it. I thought it worked really well, and it is, I think, more ecological than the original. And yeah, I think it's I think it's a great film, and it's beautiful to look at.
Villeneuve just does that right, and I feel like
Yeah.
if you ever have questions on Dave Bautista as an actor, watch him for the first few minutes of this film. He is, I think he might be the best thing in the entire film. I think he's I think he's so good in this
really,
movie.
really good.
Yeah,
it's true.
And Ford, I really liked old broken Harrison Ford in this film.
Yeah.
This sad old version of him. If Soylent Green is like this 1970s classic eco-dystopian film, is there a modern equivalent? Do you find one that's like, okay, here's something that has it's the same kind of cultural resonance?
That's a good question. I was going to say Wall-E. Basically, I think that it's a similar. It's a much more hopeful a film in a lot of ways. I think if you were looking for one that was similarly sort of dire, then maybe Don't Look Up seems to me to be like a really good climate change allegory, basically. That is sort of, to me at least, pitch perfect. It's just it's a great takedown of the way that we're kind of putting our heads in the sand about the coming climate disaster. And I'll say, like, I think it's totally understandable, that reaction. Like, I think one of the problems of environmentalism is that we're scolding people all the time and saying you should behave differently. If you acted differently as an individual, this would maybe not be happening. But it's like Don't Look Up. It's very specific people in positions of power who are driving this catastrophe, and we as individuals, obviously we can change our behavior, but it's not going to actually be a drop in the bucket. And so I think the film really gets that sort of perfectly, and then it has this very satisfying ending as well, which I won't spoil, but people get what they deserve, which is very very satisfying.
I feel like it's okay for us to ruin a 50-something-year-old film at this point in time, but maybe maybe Don't Look Up. We can save. I guess looking around, you and I were talking about, you and I both love the outdoors. Like, we're constantly outside playing around, and I think that's a really awesome thing. How do you feel? Like, do you get a sense that we're closer to this world that Soylent Green kind of pointed us to back in the 70s? Are we making any progress here? Because you and I were discussing, before we started recording, all of the stuff going on here in the States. I don't even know what's going on in Canada. It feels like we're having these backward moments at times. Are we closer to this, or do you still, Matt, do you have hope for humanity?
I do. Yeah, I do for sure. And I think what's kind of really interesting about Soylent Green in particular is how much it gets wrong, basically, and how much they get called the neo-Malthusians, the people like Paul Ehrlich who took up the this fear of overpopulation and really trumpeted it around the world, like super successful campaign in the sense that everyone got freaked out, but not in the sense that it had this many issues. And so the fear was basically that the population kept doubling, in shorter periods. And by 1960, it had doubled in 35 years. So it had gone, I think from 3 billion to 6 billion or something like that. And everybody was thinking, if it keeps doubling every 35 years, it's obviously going to be a calamity. It was justifiably scary. But, what they weren't taking into account is that as, people became more affluent worldwide and there was more stability, people started having, less and less children. And so the population has really, stabilized in some respect. It's still obviously growing and there's too many people probably on Earth. But the other thing is the Green Revolution really spread around the world. And so the Green Revolution was the invention of fertilizing, cultivation, irrigation, and sort of pesticide and herbicide techniques that really exploded the population, the food supply, so that we could feed all of these people. So all of the prognostications that Ehrlich lays out in The Population Bomb didn't come to pass. Basically, he was predicting mass starvation, like we were going to lose millions and millions and millions of people to starvation. We were going to need to cut off food aid to places like India because so many people were going to be starving there. We just had to let them all starve to death. Basically, it was this brutal rhetoric. And Soylent Green is this future where you can kind of it imagines that in 2022, New York City would be so packed that there wouldn't be anywhere to sleep for most of the people who live there. And that hasn't come to pass. Obviously, New York City is full of people, but it's not like Soylent Green. So I think one of the things about studying films from the 70s that were so dystopian and dire is that when you hear new predictions all the time about how the world's going to end tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, and you study how in the 70s they were just as convinced it was ending in the 80s, it gives you some hope. It's like, okay, we're always saying that things are right around the corner from being over. It's very politically demotivating, obviously. It doesn't get people to try to come up with intelligent solutions. And it's not necessarily true. And the environment is incredible. It's malleable. It's adaptable. The thing that we need to worry about are all the humans that are going to suffer with the coming climate change. But I think the planet as a whole, the ecosystem, some version of it is going to survive and thrive eventually. And so I have a lot of hope. Yeah. In at least in the geological sense.
Matt, you've been writing this for a little while. You've been reading this stuff. You've been watching these films. What we've been talking about the past. What happens in your future? What's that? Do you have the next book in mind? You told me you're doing stuff on Wall-E. What else what's next for you? What do you do?
Well, I'm sort of, I'm taking a bit of time to think about what's the next thing that I can think about for long enough to write a book. You have to make sure you're really, interested and it's got enough like kind of facets to it that it can keep you engaged. But I've been thinking a lot about robots lately and the way that, robots are kind of a cool, like you can choose one piece of science fiction iconography and look at how it changes through time. And I'm really fixated on these gardening robots. And so I'm starting to just think about that more and more. And I'm looking at sort of literature as well, like Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun is this, I don't know if you've read a brilliant novel about an android who becomes basically obsessed with trying to protect the environment from basically construction work machines. Like it's an android who has some sense of the world, but it's a very mixed up kind of version of it. And that's being made into a film soon. And I'm really looking forward to that. And, I've been thinking about robots a lot. And I've also been reading a lot of Greek mythology because my daughter is really into Greek mythology right now, which is not something I've ever delved into. And so I am also basically thinking about the way that robots come all the way back as in Greek mythology. They were already talking about robots. So sort of thinking about tracing that in some form.
I'm all in. What is your daughter finding fascinating about Greek? I have to ask because that's what got me in.
She's been listening
back in the day.
If I can mention another podcast, she's been listening to this podcast called Greeking Out. It's a Nat Geo podcast. It's fantastic. And, she's 7 and she is just eating it up. And she keeps referring to things that happen in day-to-day life. She'll be like, oh, it's just when Telemachus was looking for his father Odysseus. Or she's like making all these connections. And it's been great for me too, because honestly, a lot of Greek mythology has gone over my head for years. So I feel like I'm finally kind of catching up.
Are you going to go see the Odyssey this summer with her? Do you have to test it out before you go see it with her, or like?
I think I'll probably have to test it out. Yeah, that's my guess. And I'm actually reading the Odyssey right now. I've never read it,
it's my
and
favorite
so I'm trying
book
to see if I can get through it.
I mean, I feel weird calling it a book, but you get the it'll be hard to see it. Frankly, for me, it's hard for me to see anyone as Odysseus other than Sean Bean, just from that horrible Troy film. But
right.
But yeah, I think Odysseus is fascinating, right? He gets himself in more trouble than he can stand. So. Yeah. But speaking of trouble and fun, dude, this was a blast talking to you, reading this book, which is so damn cool. I have to tell you, when I saw it, I was cruising along. I was looking for something else on the website when I saw your book, and then I saw it. I was like, "Holy shit, what is this?" And I immediately reached out to Minnesota Press about this book, and then I read it, and I was like, "This is so damn cool!" And I was just overjoyed reading this. And then I'd never actually had a chance to watch Soylent Green before we did this. So it was actually my first time. And then going to talk to you today, which was awesome, dude. So thank you for coming on the pod and talk about your work, talk about this film, talk about Greek history, and all the other things, man. That's awesome.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your kind words about the book. It means so much. And thanks for having me. It's been such an interesting conversation, and I've learned a lot as well.
And that's a wrap here at Reckoning with Jason Herbert. Thank you so much to our guest, Matthew Thompson. Matt, that was an awesome conversation. I love the book. On life support, you can find it wherever you get your books. Thank you to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show run. And thank you most of all to all of you for continuing to show up, show out, and share this show with all of your friends. If you like what we're doing, make sure you're sharing this. Make sure you repost this on social media. It's the best way for us to get the news out about this podcast. So thank you so much, guys, for being here. We've got a bunch of stuff coming for you soon. So stick around. Ciao for now. Bye.